The small town of Blue Creek, Texas, was known for its quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and rich country air that seemed to calm even the most troubled soul. Nestled in the heart of downtown, there was a popular diner called Big Daddy's Smokehouse, which was run by a man named Carl O'Leary. Carl was well liked in the community. His ribeye steaks were legendary, his brisket unbeatable, and his corned beef, well, his corned beef was the stuff of local legend. People came from miles away just to taste it, but behind the smokehouse's swinging doors, something much darker was brewing. Carl had always been a perfectionist when it came to his food. He cared about his customers, and he was known for taking the time to personally select the finest cuts of meat. It was this commitment to quality that earned him a loyal following and a reputation that stretched beyond Blue Creek's borders. His restaurant was the place to go when you want a taste of authentic Texas comfort food. However, Carl's life at home was not nearly as perfect as the food he served. His wife, Marissa, had recently grown distant, spending more time on her phone and avoiding family meals. Carl tried to ignore it. He thought it was just a phase, but deep down he suspected something more. Marissa, a beautiful woman in her mid-30s with long blonde hair and striking blue eyes, had always been the center of Carl's world. They had met in college, and Carl fell for her immediately. She had a way of lighting up any room, and Carl adored her. But in recent months, there had been whispers. It started when Carl found her phone buzzing late at night with messages from a man named Adam. She said he was just a friend from work, but Carl didn't buy it. The longer he ignored it, the more paranoid he became. It wasn't long before Carl caught Marissa in a lie. She had come home late one night smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, and when Carl pressed her about it, she broke down and confessed. She had been having an affair with Adam for the last few months. The news shattered Carl. But what hurt the most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the fact that Marissa had no remorse. She had been seeing Adam while Carl worked long hours at the diner, slaving away to make ends meet. Carl didn't know how to process the pain. He spent days in a daze, cooking in the kitchen, while his thoughts raged in turmoil. What could he do? What was his next move? His mind raced with thoughts of revenge, thoughts of getting even with the woman who had betrayed him so cruelly. One night, after yet another argument where Marissa demanded a divorce, Carl finally snapped. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, yet he couldn't live with her betrayal either. The idea was ridiculous, but in his haze of anger and hurt, it seemed almost logical. Something to get her back, something that would finally make her stay. That was when he decided on the unthinkable. He would make Marissa a part of the very thing he loved most, his corned beef. Carl had been working on perfecting his corned beef recipe for years, and it had always been the star of the menu. He was meticulous about the ingredients, the seasoning, and the aging process. His meat was never rushed, but this time Carl would take a different approach. He needed the meat to be special. He needed it to be perfect. The thought consumed him. Every time he looked at Marissa, all he could think about was how she had betrayed him. She had cheated on him, and now she would pay. Her body would become a part of the dish he had perfected, an offering to the customers who adored him so much. No one would ever know. Carl's mind raced as he prepared the meal. It was sickening, yet oddly satisfying. The next morning, Carl lured Marissa into the kitchen, using their old routine of making breakfast together as a ruse. She entered without suspicion, her phone clutched in her hand as always. "Why don't you sit down and relax today, babe?" Carl said, his voice strained. He didn't want to look into her eyes. He didn't want to see the woman who had broken his heart. "I'll take care of everything. You deserve a break." Marissa, tired of the fighting, smiled. "Thanks, Carl. I appreciate it. I'll be upstairs after I check my emails." She left the kitchen and Carl waited for the moment to arrive. And when it did, Carl knew what he had to do. It was a typical Wednesday morning in Blue Creek, Texas, when the news broke. Marissa O'Leary had gone missing. Her car was still parked in the driveway, and she hadn't been seen or heard from in over 12 hours. The news spread quickly through town, like wildfire, with everyone speculating what could have happened to her. For Carl, however, the world seemed to freeze. He stood in the kitchen of his smokehouse, his hands trembling as he wiped the counter clean for the umpteenth time. He had just received the call from the sheriff's office about his wife's disappearance, and his mind was spinning. How had she just vanished? One minute she was here, and the next gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that she had left willingly. Carl felt his heart race and his pulse quicken. He had been in the diner all night after all, preparing for the morning rush and working on some new recipes. It wasn't unusual for him to stay late, but that meant there was no evidence linking him to her disappearance. He quickly pulled himself together, wiping his hands on his apron, trying to act like everything was normal. But deep down, Carl knew something wasn't right. The night before Marissa disappeared, they had fought. Again. She had been distant for weeks, and Carl had finally confronted her about the affair. His suspicions were confirmed. Marissa had been seeing someone else. The name Adam had come up in their argument, and the moment she uttered it, Carl felt the ground beneath him give way. Adam, a man she met at work, had been the source of her growing detachment. He had been the one who had stolen her heart, and Carl had been left in the dark, oblivious to the truth until it was too late. But why would she disappear? Why wouldn't she just leave him? Carl couldn't wrap his mind around it. As Carl tried to make sense of the situation, the small town of Blue Creek rallied around him. The sheriff's department launched a search for Marissa, and soon the streets were filled with volunteers, neighbors, friends, even the staff from Big Daddy's Smokehouse, scouring the town for any sign of her. The police questioned everyone who might have had any contact with Marissa recently, hoping to get some clue as to her whereabouts. Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived in Blue Creek that afternoon to take over the investigation. She was a seasoned investigator with over 10 years of experience, and she had handled her share of missing persons cases. But there was something about this case that seemed different. The absence of Marissa O'Leary didn't feel like the typical runaway or voluntary disappearance. It felt darker, like there was something sinister hiding just beneath the surface. When Sarah arrived at Carl's house, the scene was chaotic. There were cars lined up and down the street, police officers talking in hushed tones, and concerned neighbors offering condolences to Carl. Detective Mitchell, a uniformed officer, greeted her as she stepped out of her unmarked car. "Carl O'Leary is waiting for you inside." Sarah nodded and followed the officer through the front door. Carl was sitting in a chair by the kitchen table, his face a mask of worry. His hands fidgeted nervously as she entered, but he stood up immediately, extending his hand. "Detective, I'm so glad you're here. I don't know what's happening. Marissa's just gone. I don't know where she went." Sarah gave him a tight smile, shaking his hand. She knew that he was trying to appear calm, but the anxiety in his eyes was hard to miss. "I'm going to ask you some questions, Carl. We need to get to the bottom of this. I need you to be as truthful as possible. Can you do that?" Carl nodded, sitting back down in the chair. "Of course, Detective. I'll do anything to help find her." "Let's start from the beginning," Sarah said, taking a seat across from him. "When was the last time you saw Marissa?" Carl swallowed hard. "Last night," he said, his voice low. "We had dinner together, but we got into an argument. She told me she was leaving. She said she couldn't stay in this marriage anymore." Sarah's eyebrows furrowed. "Why did she want to leave?" Carl hesitated before answering, looking down at his hands. "She said it was over between us, that she'd found someone else, that she didn't love me anymore." A beat passed before Sarah spoke again. "Did she say who this someone else was?" Carl stiffened. "She mentioned a name, Adam. He's someone she met at work. I don't know much about him, but I'm pretty sure they've been seeing each other for a while now." "Did you and Marissa argue about him?" "Yes," Carl admitted. "I was furious. I accused her of cheating on me, and she didn't deny it. She said it was over." Sarah listened carefully, her mind processing the information. The fact that Carl was so open about the affair was a bit odd. Most men would have been more defensive, especially if they were involved in something like this. But Carl seemed genuinely hurt. Perhaps it was genuine guilt, or perhaps it was a facade. Sarah wasn't sure yet. "Did Marissa say anything else last night?" she asked, wanting to see if Carl's story matched up. Carl shook his head. "No, not really. She just packed a bag and left around midnight. She said she was going to stay with a friend. I don't know who, though." "And you haven't heard from her since?" Carl paused. "No, Detective, nothing." Sarah stood up, glancing around the house. Everything appeared neat, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But something about Carl's demeanor didn't sit well with her. He seemed too composed for someone who had just lost his wife, yet his every word seemed to betray a deeper emotion. He was worried but not overly frantic. "I'll need to speak to some of your neighbors," Sarah said. "And I'll need to search the house, Carl, to see if there's anything that could help us find Marissa." Carl nodded, looking resigned. "Of course. Anything you need." As Sarah moved through the house, her eyes caught sight of something strange. A half-empty bottle of expensive whiskey on the counter, along with two glasses. It was as if Carl had been drinking to cope, but something about it felt off. The way the glasses were placed suggested that they had been used recently, but Carl had mentioned having dinner alone. After Sarah finished searching the house, she stepped back outside. The investigation was just beginning, but she had a strong feeling that Carl was hiding something. Whether it was guilt or fear, she couldn't tell, but she knew that he was the key to unlocking what had happened to Marissa. That evening, Sarah ordered a full background check on Adam, Marissa's lover. She had already begun questioning Carl's alibi. He had claimed to be at the diner all night, but she needed more than just his word. She needed evidence. As she sat at her desk, she sifted through the police reports and gathered what little evidence she had. The most disturbing thing, however, was the fact that no one had seen Marissa leave the house. The door was locked from the inside, and there were no signs of struggle. It was as though she had simply disappeared into thin air. The next day, Sarah revisited the diner where Carl worked. She needed to know more about his relationship with Marissa, and the staff there might have some answers. She spoke to a few of the employees who all mentioned how much Carl had been struggling lately. One waitress mentioned that Carl seemed distracted in the weeks leading up to Marissa's disappearance. He had been working late more often, and his temper had become shorter. Another cook noted that Carl had been more secretive than usual, spending time in the back room, away from the customers. But no one suspected Carl of anything sinister. Not yet. Detective Sarah Mitchell was no closer to finding out what happened to Marissa O'Leary. But she knew one thing for sure. Carl O'Leary was hiding something, and she would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. The investigation into Marissa O'Leary's disappearance was moving at a glacial pace. Detective Sarah Mitchell had been working tirelessly, poring over every scrap of evidence, every word spoken by Carl O'Leary and the people around him. But despite her efforts, nothing seemed to add up. It was like Marissa had vanished into thin air. The town of Blue Creek was still reeling from the shock. The small community was tight-knit, and the disappearance of one of their own had rattled everyone. Carl, who had once been known for his legendary corned beef and unbeatable brisket, was now the subject of every conversation. Some believed he was innocent, just a broken man grieving the loss of his wife. Others, like Sarah, felt there was more to the story. That afternoon, Sarah sat in her car, parked just outside Big Daddy's Smokehouse. The restaurant was quiet, with only a few patrons seated at the counter. Carl had been at the diner when Marissa disappeared, or so he claimed. His alibi had been corroborated by some of the staff, but there were still too many unanswered questions for Sarah to feel comfortable letting him off the hook. She was about to head inside when her phone rang. It was Officer Johnson from the sheriff's office. "Detective Mitchell, we found something you might want to see. It's about Carl." Her heart skipped a beat. She quickly answered, "What have you found?" Johnson's voice sounded hesitant. "We've just gone through some of the surveillance footage from the diner. You need to come by. It's important." When Sarah arrived at the sheriff's office, she was ushered into a small, dimly lit room where Officer Johnson was waiting. The monitor on the desk showed footage from one of the diner's security cameras. The timestamp on the video read 1:15 a.m., the exact time Carl had claimed to be working alone in the kitchen, preparing for the early morning rush. On the screen, Carl was visible, standing at the counter, his back to the camera. He was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. Sarah watched intently, noting how Carl seemed on edge, his movements erratic. But what caught her attention wasn't Carl's nervous behavior. It was what happened next. A figure appeared at the door. It was Marissa. Sarah froze. Marissa stepped inside the diner, her face pale and tired. She looked around nervously, as if she was making sure no one else was around. She approached Carl, who turned and seemed surprised to see her. They exchanged words, but Sarah couldn't hear what they were saying. Marissa's body language was stiff, almost like she was trying to avoid something, someone. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she turned and left the diner. Carl watched her leave, then slowly walked to the back of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a rag. "Do you think he knew she was coming?" Officer Johnson asked, watching Sarah closely. "I don't know," Sarah murmured, her mind racing. "But this changes everything. If Carl was really working all night, why was Marissa there? And why did she leave so quickly? It doesn't add up." Johnson nodded. "We've got a lot of questions for him now." The next morning, Sarah revisited Carl's house, her mind heavy with suspicion. She needed to confront him about the footage and the mysterious late-night visit from his wife. The detective had done her homework and knew that Carl's story didn't match the timeline. She wasn't sure what he was hiding, but she was determined to find out. Carl answered the door, his face pale and tired. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. But when he saw Sarah standing on his doorstep, something in his eyes shifted. There was a flicker of fear, almost like he was expecting her. "Detective, what's going on? Have you found her? Is Marissa—" "Can we talk?" Sarah interrupted, her voice calm but firm. Carl stepped aside, allowing her to enter. His house was quiet, too quiet for someone whose wife had gone missing. Sarah followed him into the living room, where they both sat down. "I saw the footage," Sarah said, her gaze never leaving Carl. "You know the one I'm talking about. Marissa came into the diner last night." Carl's face stiffened, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw a flicker of something, guilt perhaps, pass through his eyes. I didn't think you'd see that." "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah asked, her voice cold. Carl shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was silent for a moment, as if he was struggling with whether or not to confess. Finally, he spoke. "She came to talk to me," Carl said quietly. "She wanted to tell me that she was leaving. For good. She was going to be with Adam. She said it was over, that she couldn't stand being with me anymore." "And you didn't try to stop her?" Sarah asked, narrowing her eyes. "You didn't try to convince her to stay?" Carl shook his head, his hands trembling slightly. I didn't want to force her to stay. I loved her, but she made up her mind. I just wanted her to be safe, to be happy. She was already gone, Detective. I knew that." Sarah studied him for a long moment, watching the way he spoke, the way his eyes darted around the room. There was something about his story that didn't sit right with her. But what really bothered her was the fact that he had never mentioned Marissa's visit until now. Why had he kept it a secret? What was he hiding? "Then why didn't you tell the police that she came to see you?" Sarah pressed, leaning forward. "Why didn't you mention it when you gave your statement?" Carl's eyes darted to the floor. He seemed to be struggling with his words. "I didn't think it mattered. She came in, told me she was leaving, and that was it. She left, and I haven't seen her since. I didn't want to complicate things." Sarah wasn't buying it. Something about Carl's demeanor felt wrong. The more she questioned him, the more she realized that his answers were vague and evasive. There were gaps in his story, and the way he reacted to the footage didn't seem like the behavior of a grieving husband. It was almost as if he was trying too hard to appear innocent. "I'm going to need to search your restaurant," Sarah said, her voice firm. Carl looked up at her, his face paling. "What? Why?" "I need to check the kitchen," Sarah replied. "We've found some discrepancies in your story, Carl. I'm going to need you to cooperate if you want us to find your wife." For a moment, Carl hesitated. He looked like he was about to argue, but then, almost as if resigned to his fate, he nodded. "Fine. I'll show you the kitchen. But there's nothing there. You won't find anything." As Carl led Sarah through the back door of the diner, the smell of smoked meat and spices hung thick in the air. The kitchen was spotless, just as Carl had promised. But Sarah's sharp eyes caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. There on the counter was a large pot simmering on the stove. The lid was slightly askew, and a strange, almost sickly sweet smell wafted from it. Sarah could feel her stomach churn. "What's cooking, Carl?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, though she felt an unease creeping up her spine. Carl hesitated. "Just a new recipe. I've been experimenting with some new ideas for the menu." Sarah slowly walked over to the stove. her eyes never leaving Carl's face. What exactly is in the pot? I told you, it's just food, Carl said, his voice a little too sharp. But Sarah wasn't fooled. She lifted the lid of the pot. The contents were dark and stewing in a thick, reddish-brown sauce. It didn't look like any dish she'd ever seen before. She took a breath. Something about the whole situation felt off, and the smell was making her head spin. You're going to need to explain this, Carl, she said quietly. Now. Carl's face paled even more as he realized the gravity of the situation. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, Carl murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for anyone to find out. And in that moment, Sarah knew. She had stumbled upon something dark, something far worse than she could have imagined. Something had gone terribly wrong in Carl's world, and this was just the beginning. The thick, acrid smell from the pot on the stove seemed to intensify as Sarah stood there, her mind racing. It wasn't just the strange appearance of the contents that unsettled her. It was the undeniable sense of something terribly wrong. She could feel a cold sweat forming on her brow, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as she stared down at the dark, soupy mixture simmering in the pot. Carl, standing behind her, was pale. His hands were shaking, and for the first time Sarah saw a crack in his composure. He was no longer the calm, collected man he had portrayed himself to be. The truth was starting to surface, whether he wanted it to or not. You're going to have to explain this, Carl, Sarah repeated, her voice steady but cold. What exactly is this? Carl swallowed hard, his throat dry. His eyes flickered nervously toward the pot, and then back to Sarah. It's just food, detective. I told you. I've been working on a new recipe, something for the diner. It's a secret recipe. A secret recipe? Sarah's eyes narrowed as she glanced at the dark liquid. There was something deeply unsettling about the texture and the smell. It didn't resemble anything that would come from a standard diner kitchen. Her stomach churned and she felt the urge to look away. But she couldn't. This was the moment. This was the clue that could unravel everything. Carl, listen to me, Sarah said firmly, keeping her voice low, yet with an edge that made Carl flinch. We're not here to play games. I've been patient, but now you need to tell me the truth. What is this really? Carl seemed to be fighting with himself, his eyes darting around as if he were looking for an escape. But there was nowhere to go. He had nowhere to run. He had nowhere to hide the truth. Finally, with a shaky breath, Carl spoke. It's Marissa, he whispered. It's Marissa, detective. She's in the pot. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She heard the words, but her mind refused to process them. It felt like a sick joke, a twisted lie, something she could dismiss as the ramblings of a desperate man. But the way Carl spoke, so quietly, so calmly, told her that he wasn't lying. He wasn't trying to trick her. Marissa O'Leary, his wife, the woman who had gone missing just days ago. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she slowly turned her head, looking into Carl's eyes for the first time. There was a coldness in them now, a hollow, empty look that made her stomach twist. It was the look of a man who had already crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I didn't mean for it to go this far, Carl murmured, his voice trembling. But she betrayed me, Sarah. She didn't love me anymore. She was going to leave me for Adam. I couldn't let her go. Not like that. I thought if I could just make her stay, if I could just keep her with me, everything would go back to how it was before. But she didn't want me. She wanted him. The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She took a step back, trying to process the enormity of what Carl was saying. This wasn't just a case of a missing person. It wasn't just a tragic disappearance. This was murder. Cold, calculated, and now as she looked down at the pot, it had taken on an even darker form. This wasn't some ordinary crime. It was the ultimate betrayal. Carl's voice cracked as he continued. I couldn't stand it. She was going to leave me and I couldn't bear the thought of it. So I did what I thought I had to do. I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want anyone to see her like this. But I thought I could keep her here, just for a little while longer. Sarah stood frozen, her mind swirling. She couldn't comprehend the words coming from Carl's mouth. He had just admitted to something so horrific, so vile, that it felt like the ground beneath her was crumbling. There was no denying it now. Carl O'Leary had killed his wife. "You killed her?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Carl nodded, the tears welling up in his eyes. "I didn't mean to, not at first. I just wanted to talk to her. I just wanted her to stay. But when she wouldn't listen, when she kept saying she was done, I lost control. I hit her. I didn't even mean to. But she was hurt and then I realized what I had done. I didn't want anyone to know. I didn't want anyone to find out. So you did this?" Sarah's voice was sharp, the disgust and anger in her tone evident. "You turned her into this?" Carl's face contorted with shame, his eyes filled with regret. "I didn't know what else to do, Detective. I didn't know how to make it stop. It was too late. She was gone, and I had to hide it. So I made her part of the menu. No one would suspect. No one would ever know." The words were impossible to fully grasp. A murder so twisted, so horrific, that it defied any sort of logical reasoning. But the evidence was right in front of her. There was no denying what Carl had done. And now, as Sarah's mind grappled with the reality of it all, she realized that she wasn't dealing with a simple missing persons case anymore. This was a murder investigation, and it was up to her to bring Carl O'Leary to justice. Sarah's first instinct was to call for backup. She needed more officers, more resources to process the crime scene, to secure the evidence before Carl could destroy anything else. She didn't want to believe it, but she had no choice but to act quickly. The longer Carl remained unchecked, the more danger he posed, not just to her, but to anyone who might cross his path. She quickly called Officer Johnson, ordering him to assemble a team and head to Big Daddy's smokehouse. She needed a warrant to seize the premises, to search for any more evidence of Marissa's body, and to stop Carl before he could do any further damage. Carl wasn't the only victim in this twisted story. There were others out there, others who had no idea they were consuming something that had once been human. But Sarah wasn't going to let that happen, not on her watch. As Sarah stepped back from the stove, her mind still reeling from Carl's confession, she noticed the faint sound of a door opening. She turned, her hand instinctively going to her holster, but it was only Officer Johnson. "I've got the backup you requested, Detective," he said, his face grim. "What's going on? What's in the pot?" Sarah couldn't speak. She just motioned to Carl, who was sitting at the table now, his face buried in his hands. "Carl O'Leary just confessed to killing his wife, Marissa," Sarah said, her voice cold and steady, though inside her heart was racing. "And he's been serving her to customers. We need to secure this place and find everything we can before he can destroy the evidence." Johnson didn't waste any time. He immediately began to coordinate the backup team, and within minutes, they were inside the diner, seizing the premises. Carl O'Leary was taken into custody, and the investigation into his horrific crime began in earnest. But as Sarah stood there, watching the officers work, a lingering thought gnawed at her. Carl had been running his business for years. How many people had eaten his special dishes? How many had unknowingly consumed Marissa's remains? The truth, as it turned out, was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The case was far from over. But for Sarah, it was just the beginning of uncovering the full scope of Carl O'Leary's twisted crime. She was determined to make sure that justice was served, not just for Marissa, but for everyone who had been affected by the horror that Carl had created. The investigation would take months, but one thing was clear. Carl O'Leary would not get away with this. Not while Sarah Mitchell was on the case. The truth would come out. The days following Carl O'Leary's arrest were filled with the slow, painstaking work of piecing together the full scope of his crime. Detective Sarah Mitchell couldn't shake the images that had been burned into her mind. Marissa's name, the chilling confession, the unnerving discovery in the pot. But there was still so much left to uncover. Carl was now in custody, charged with the murder of his wife, Marissa. The town of Blue Creek was still reeling from the revelation that their beloved chef had committed such a gruesome act. People were scared, people were angry, and Sarah felt the weight of their emotions as she moved forward in the investigation. There were still too many unanswered questions. Her primary focus was now gathering evidence. connecting the dots, and making sure that Carl faced justice for what he had done. But as she poured through the evidence, Sarah started to realize that Carl's crime wasn't just a one-off act of rage. It was the culmination of years of darkness festering beneath the surface. The more she learned, the more it became clear that this was no random act of violence. It was something planned, something orchestrated, and perhaps even worse, something hidden in plain sight. The first thing Sarah did after securing the scene at Big Daddy's Smokehouse was to inspect the inventory records and food suppliers for the diner. She needed to understand how Carl had been able to carry out such an atrocity without anyone noticing. According to his employees, Carl had always been secretive about his recipes, his ingredients. The idea of selling food that was different wasn't anything new. He had a reputation for being eccentric, always experimenting with new flavors. But this was something far darker. With the help of Officer Johnson, Sarah began her search through Carl's receipts, invoices, and order logs. They found records of unusually large orders of spices, seasoning, and obscure cuts of meat that hadn't been used before. There were also several suppliers who had been paid under different names, leading Sarah to suspect that Carl had gone to great lengths to conceal where the meat had come from. It didn't take long for Sarah to make another grim discovery. One of the suppliers had recently reported a missing shipment, a shipment that had been sent to Big Daddy's Smokehouse. The shipment in question was an unusual order of premium quality cuts, but the quantity and the timing raised red flags. The supplier had found out later that the order had been signed for by Carl himself, and the shipment was recorded as delivered and received, with no further inquiries. Sarah's heart sank when she realized the full implications of what she was seeing. Carl had not only killed Marissa, but he had been systematically buying and hiding the evidence. He had made sure that no one would ask questions about where his meat was coming from, even if the customers were unknowingly consuming human flesh. By the time Sarah visited Carl's house again, she was armed with a mountain of evidence. Carl had given her only fragments of the truth, but now she had a clear picture, and she was ready to confront him once more. Carl sat behind bars, but his demeanor had changed. The initial shock and fear had worn off. Now there was a kind of resignation in his eyes, something that suggested he had come to terms with the reality of what he had done. But Sarah wasn't done yet. She needed the truth from him, all of it. She stood before him, calm but determined. "Carl," she began, her voice steady, "I need you to tell me everything. About your suppliers, about how you were able to cover this up. How long has this been going on?" Carl didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked down at his hands, the chains clinking softly as he moved them. He was quiet for a moment, collecting his thoughts, or perhaps deciding how much more he was willing to admit. I never meant for anyone to find out," Carl said finally, his voice hoarse. "I started doing this after Marissa started seeing Adam. I wasn't just angry at her. I was desperate. I didn't want to lose everything I had, my restaurant, my life, my wife. I thought if I could just make her stay, everything would go back to the way it was before. But it didn't work out that way. And when I hit her, when I lost control, I knew I had to do something to hide it. I couldn't let anyone know what I'd done. So I decided to do what I've always done. Make something people would love. Something they would crave. That's when I started experimenting with the meat. I knew it was sick, but I couldn't stop." Sarah's stomach turned as she listened to him speak. His words were chilling, but his calm demeanor suggested he had been living with this darkness for much longer than anyone could have imagined. "You didn't just kill your wife, Carl," Sarah said, her voice thick with disgust. "You served her. You turned her into food. You turned her into a commodity. How many people have eaten her, Carl? How many?" Carl's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might break. But instead, he spoke with a resigned calmness. "I don't know. Maybe 50 people. Maybe more. They loved it. They couldn't get enough of it. The corned beef, the brisket. I made it all special for them. I knew they wouldn't ask questions. And even if they did, I made sure no one would find out. I kept everything hidden. It was perfect." Sarah's mind was reeling. The depth of Carl's depravity was beyond anything she had anticipated. He wasn't just a murderer. He was a man who had twisted a crime into a business, profiting from the most horrifying act imaginable. "I'll make sure everyone knows the truth, Carl," Sarah said quietly, her voice unwavering. "I'm going to expose what you've done. The entire town deserves to know." The next few days were filled with the necessary legal procedures. Carl was formally charged with the murder of Marissa O'Leary, and further charges were pending for his role in the sale of human flesh. The authorities worked around the clock to collect DNA samples, to confirm that the meat Carl had been serving came from Marissa. The tests, as expected, came back confirming the unthinkable. Marissa O'Leary's remains had been consumed by countless unsuspecting customers. Sarah was disgusted by the realization that Carl's restaurant had been an unsuspecting hotspot for cannibalistic cuisine. The investigation continued to unfold, revealing more and more disturbing details about how Carl had managed to keep the truth hidden. But it wasn't just about Carl anymore. It was about the people he had betrayed, his customers, his community, and his wife. Carl O'Leary was a man who had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal his darkest impulses. But now the truth was out. His reign of terror was over. But even as the case moved forward, Sarah couldn't shake the haunting thought that lingered in her mind. How many others out there, across the country, had been unknowingly consuming human flesh? How many other chefs, restaurateurs, or twisted individuals had taken advantage of the unsuspecting public, hiding their crimes behind the veil of their culinary talents? This case had opened a door to something darker than Sarah had ever imagined. And while justice would be served for Marissa, she couldn't help but wonder how. The courtroom was packed. People from all walks of life had come to see Carl O'Leary, the once celebrated chef turned notorious murderer, face justice for his crime. There was a heavy air of disbelief that clung to the room, as if the entire town still couldn't fully comprehend what had happened. How had this man, someone they had trusted, someone who had been a fixture in their community, turned out to be a monster? Detective Sarah Mitchell stood near the back of the courtroom, watching as Carl was escorted to the defendant's table. His expression was blank, almost empty. It was the same look he had given her during their last conversation at the jail. There were no tears, no signs of guilt, no sense of remorse. There was just silence. Sarah had been working tirelessly in the weeks following Carl's arrest, gathering evidence, processing the DNA results, and speaking to the families of the victims who had unknowingly eaten Marissa's remains. But as the trial began, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the case pressing down on her. The sense of closure was still far away. It wasn't just the murder of Marissa O'Leary that haunted Sarah. It was the knowledge that Carl's crime wasn't an isolated event. In fact, there were whispers, disturbing rumors, that other restaurants, other towns, had experienced similar disappearances. Could there be other cases like this one? Or was Carl O'Leary just the tip of a much darker iceberg? The prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Adam Roach, stood at the front of the courtroom, ready to present his case. He was a man of few words, but his presence commanded attention. He knew this case inside and out, and Sarah could sense his focus. He was ready to tear apart Carl's defense and expose the truth to the world. But Sarah knew that Carl's defense team would put up a fight. They would try to paint him as a victim of circumstance, a man pushed to the edge by the infidelity of his wife. They would try to humanize him, to convince the jury that he was a man who had lost control in the heat of passion, and that his actions, though horrific, were the result of a crime of passion. It was a tactic that had been used before, and Sarah knew it was dangerous. As the trial proceeded, Sarah couldn't help but notice that Carl wasn't the only one who had remained eerily calm. His lawyer, a slick individual named Robert Blackwell, was smooth, calculated, and intent on making the jury believe that Carl was not fully responsible for his actions. The defense would argue that Marissa's betrayal had driven Carl to the edge, and that he had acted out of rage, without full comprehension of the consequences of his actions. But Sarah knew better. She knew the truth, and she was determined to make sure the world knew it too. She had spent countless hours going through Carl's financial records, tracing his shipments of meat, and questioning the suppliers who had unwittingly enabled him. The more she dug, the more disturbing it became. The investigation was still ongoing, despite the fact that Carl had already been arrested and was facing trial. Sarah had received several calls from colleagues in other cities, and what she was hearing made her stomach churn. Several towns in the surrounding areas had experienced unusual disappearances, and in some of these cases, there were reports of missing people who were last seen at restaurants or diners with similar backgrounds to Big Daddy's Smokehouse. Could it be that Carl O'Leary wasn't the only one involved in this twisted network of cannibalism? The thought gnawed at Sarah as she sat in her office late at night, going over the case files once again. It was a horrifying prospect, but the evidence was beginning to pile up. She couldn't ignore it. Carl wasn't alone in this. She had started connecting dots between some of the missing persons cases and local restaurants. Sarah knew that her hunch could take her down a very dangerous road, but she had no choice. This was a part of the investigation that could no longer be ignored. There were restaurants in nearby towns that had been in business for decades, with loyal customers who swore by the food. But after Marissa's case hit the news, a strange pattern began to emerge. Missing persons in the area, people who had disappeared without a trace, had been spotted at these same restaurants shortly before their disappearance. It wasn't just the food, it was the people who ran these places. Something about their operations seemed off, like they were hiding something. Sarah spent the next few days visiting these restaurants, posing as a curious customer. She wasn't looking for immediate answers. She was observing, listening, and getting a feel for the vibe. There were whispers of strange dishes being served, off-the-menu items that customers couldn't explain. Just like Carl's Diner, these restaurants had their secrets. But this was bigger than just a few rogue chefs. This was a network. The breakthrough came when Sarah visited a town called Glen Hollow, about an hour's drive from Blue Creek. She had received a tip from an anonymous source who claimed that the owners of a local steakhouse, Jimmy's Prime Cuts, were involved in illegal activities. The tip seemed vague at first, but Sarah couldn't ignore it. She knew that if she didn't follow this lead, she might never get another chance. Jimmy's Prime Cuts was a popular establishment known for its high-end steaks and exclusive dining experience. From the outside, it appeared like any other upscale restaurant. But as Sarah sat down at one of the tables, she noticed something unsettling. The menu seemed overly elaborate, with an odd focus on exotic cuts of meat. It wasn't unusual for a steakhouse to tout special cuts, but this was different. The prices for certain cuts were absurdly high, and some of the dishes seemed, well, unexplainable. Sarah ordered one of these signature dishes, a dish that had gained a cult following among regulars. It was a rich stew, prepared in an ancient recipe that the owner, a man named Jimmy Albright, claimed had been passed down through generations. The stew was dark and thick, with chunks of meat that didn't quite resemble anything she had ever eaten before. As the waiter set the dish down in front of her, Sarah's suspicions grew. She could see the excitement in the other diners' faces. Many of them were on their second or third bowl of the stew. They couldn't get enough of it. It was addictive. After her meal, Sarah discreetly visited the kitchen, pretending to ask about the recipe. What she saw inside made her stomach turn. There were several large bags of what appeared to be meat stored in a walk-in cooler, but the labels were covered with tape. The smell was overpowering, a sickly sweet odor that she couldn't place. It wasn't long before she realized that she wasn't the only one who had noticed something odd about Jimmy's Prime Cuts. A group of customers had gathered in the corner of the restaurant, talking quietly about strange disappearances from their town. People who had eaten there and then vanished. Sarah knew she had stumbled onto something big. The more Sarah dug into Jimmy Albright's past, the more unsettling details emerged. He had a criminal record, one that had been conveniently sealed, but it was there. He had a history of illegal activities, and there were reports of strange disappearances in Glen Hollow dating back years. But no one had ever connected the dots until now. It was clear that Carl O'Leary wasn't alone in his crimes. The network was larger than anyone had imagined, and it stretched across the state. And it wasn't just limited to Texas. The more Sarah investigated, the more she realized that the issue went far beyond regional borders. A shadowy network of cannibalistic chefs and restaurateurs had existed for years, and it was now her job to expose it all. But Carl O'Leary was just the beginning. The investigation was far from over. As Sarah sat at her desk, sifting through the new evidence, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The web was expanding. This was bigger than she had anticipated, and there were still so many unanswered questions. How many people had been unknowingly fed human meat? How many more were involved in this criminal network? The answers were out there, and Sarah Mitchell was determined to find them. But as she looked out the window, the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, she knew one thing for sure: the storm was just beginning. The days following Sarah's visit to Jimmy's Prime Cuts were filled with a quiet, constant buzz of activity. She knew she was on the precipice of something much bigger than the Carl O'Leary case. The more she uncovered, the more it became apparent that this twisted network of cannibalistic chefs and restaurateurs wasn't confined to a single region, or even just the state of Texas. It spanned across the country, secret, hidden, insidious, and it was operating right under everyone's noses. The question that haunted Sarah wasn't just how many people were involved, it was how much further this went. What started with a single murder, Marissa O'Leary's, was now spiraling into something far more complex, and it was becoming harder to distinguish where the truth ended and the lies began. Sarah had spent the last few weeks working tirelessly, going through more files, following up on tips, and building a network of her own. She'd connected with investigators from other cities, other states. The similarities between Carl's case and the emerging reports from other regions were too stark to ignore. Restaurants, diners, and steakhouses, often locally owned and beloved by their communities, were involved. They had all been hiding something dark, something sickening, and it wasn't just one or two isolated incidents. It was a coordinated operation, one that stretched across state lines and possibly beyond. Her phone rang early one morning. It was Adam Roach, the prosecutor. His voice was tense, but there was an edge of finality to it. "Sarah, I need you here now. We have something big, and I think you need to see it before we move forward with the trial." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had been anticipating something like this, but the urgency in Adam's voice made her stomach tighten. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and she couldn't afford to miss anything. By the time Sarah arrived at the courthouse, Adam was waiting for her by the elevators. His face was tight, his eyes grim. "Is this about Carl?" Sarah asked, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Not exactly," Adam said, leading her down a hallway. "It's about something else we discovered, something even darker than we imagined." Adam stopped in front of a door marked Evidence Room. He tapped in the code and the door opened with a quiet creak. Inside, a stack of folders lay on a table, accompanied by several large manila envelopes. Sarah could already tell from the heavy weight of the documents that this wasn't just paperwork. It was information that had the potential to blow the entire case wide open. "What is all this?" Sarah asked, feeling a mixture of excitement and unease. "These are reports from a federal investigation. We've been looking into restaurant operations across the country, but there's one thing that's really stood out to us," Adam said, his voice laced with disbelief. "These reports, they match Carl's case almost to the letter. The ingredients, the suppliers, the patterns of disappearance. It's all here." Sarah's fingers trembled as she flipped through the files. Her eyes scanned page after page, and as she did, she realized that Carl's murder of Marissa wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something much larger, something far more sinister. In one folder, Sarah found the names of several restaurants located in multiple states: Blue Creek, Glen Hollow, and others that hadn't even made the news yet. Each one had been under suspicion for human trafficking and food contamination, but nothing had ever been substantiated until now. And then, there it was. In a particularly detailed report, a connection to a single company kept reappearing: a distribution network named Fresh Cuts Incorporated, a company responsible for supplying meat to dozens of different eateries across the United States. The name rang a bell. It had come up in her initial investigation, but back then, she'd written it off as an ordinary supplier. Now, seeing the pattern emerging, she couldn't ignore it any longer. "Fresh Cuts," Sarah whispered aloud. "This was bigger than I thought." Adam nodded gravely. "Yes, they've been involved in the supply chain for all these restaurants, hundreds of them. And they're not just supplying ordinary cuts of beef. There's a deeper connection, one we can't ignore anymore. It seems the company has been involved in providing human meat." Sarah felt the weight of the words sink in. A distribution company, a well-oiled machine that had been quietly moving human remains across the country. She glanced at the documents again, her pulse racing. There were records of shipments, dates, locations, quantities that traced the path from suppliers to kitchens, from farms to meat lockers, then into the unsuspecting mouths of customers. It was horrifying, systematic, a monstrous operation built on the suffering and death of countless victims. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Sarah and Adam visited one of Fresh Cut's warehouses. The location had been flagged by a source within the food industry, and it was time for Sarah to see the evidence for herself. The warehouse was a nondescript building on the outskirts of a small town just north of Blue Creek. As they pulled up to the facility, Sarah could sense the atmosphere was different. There were fewer cars, and the facility appeared strangely quiet for a distribution center. Inside, a tall, sharp-faced man greeted them. He introduced himself as Rick, a manager at Fresh Cuts. He was polite, but there was a tense edge to his smile, as if he knew something wasn't quite right. "We're happy to show you around, Detective," Rick said, leading them through the vast, chilled warehouse. It was meticulously organized, but Sarah noticed there was an unusual number of refrigerated storage units. As they passed each one, she felt her skin crawl, but she couldn't put her finger on why. Finally, they reached the back of the warehouse, where Sarah's suspicions were confirmed. In one of the cold storage units, there were dozens of packages, all carefully sealed. The labeling on them was consistent, but the contents weren't what Sarah expected. The meat was clearly not beef. She opened one of the packages and her stomach turned. It was human flesh. The cuts, the texture, the unmistakable color, all of it matched the descriptions Sarah had read about from Carl's victims. These weren't just isolated cases. This was an organized operation spanning across multiple states. Rick's face turned pale when he saw the shock on Sarah's face. I don't know how to explain this, Detective," he stammered. "I thought—" "Thought what?" Sarah snapped, her voice trembling with fury. "That you were just moving beef?" Rick dropped his head in defeat. We didn't know it would go this far. At first, it was just a way to make some extra money, selling meat no one would miss. But then it became bigger, it became a business, and I got caught up in it. I swear, I never thought—" "Save it," Sarah interrupted. "You're under arrest, and so is everyone else involved in this operation." The investigation had reached its climax, but the revelations kept coming. Carl O'Leary had never been the mastermind. He was merely one of many pawns in a much larger operation. The true scale of the human trafficking ring that had been supplying restaurants with human flesh was unfathomable. Dozens of chefs, managers, and suppliers were implicated. The arrest of Rick and his colleagues at Fresh Cuts was just the beginning. In the following weeks, authorities dismantled the network, uncovering an elaborate chain of exploitation, human trafficking, and organized crime. Investigations into missing persons cases from across the nation continued to expand, and more victims were identified. As for Carl O'Leary, his trial was just the tip of the iceberg. He would face charges for murder, but the full extent of his role in the network wasn't revealed until much later. His fate, along with the others involved in the ring, would eventually be sealed. For Sarah, this case was the culmination of months of hard work and relentless pursuit of justice. But the journey didn't end there. The truth had been uncovered, but the damage had been done. The trust in the food industry would never be the same again, and Sarah would never forget the darkness she had uncovered, a darkness that was far closer to home than anyone could have imagined. The world was watching, and the final unveiling had left a permanent scar on the fabric of society. It was a scar that would take years to heal,